So the idea of this paper is that judges might not necessarily always vote completely honestly on cases. They might have reasons to want to vote strategically to mask their ideology. Now everybody knows that, everybody agrees that judges are not always completely upfront about what their true preferences are. For example, if anybody's listened to judicial nomination hearings, we hear the little dance that the justices and the senators go through trying to pin down the nominee on what he or she would do if she was got to the court. But then everybody assumes, okay, once you're on the court, it's open season, you're going to just fully reveal your preferences. And we want to question that, and we'll talk, and the idea of this paper is that you can influence who your future colleagues are if you exercise, you know, a little bit of restraint, a little bit of strategy, maybe not sort of putting it all out there straight away. You know, if you're an extremist justice, even once you're on the court, you might want to moderate a little bit, at least at first. And if there's one takeaway from this paper, it's that we can trust later behavior more than we can trust earlier behavior, because obviously that incentive dissipates over time. All right, so that's sort of the general idea of the paper, but there are a couple of motivations and literatures that this paper addresses. The first is we see a lot of literature these days about judicial preferences changing over time. And we have these graphs that show oh, there's not a laser on here, that show change over time of specific justices. Justice Blackmun being an example that everybody points to strongly, became much more liberal. So this is conservative liberal. The higher up you are, the more conservative you are over time, becoming more liberal. Justice Scalia maybe becoming a bit more conservative over time. And from this, people have said, oh, you know, judicial preferences change over time. And for us, that's a bit of a jump. We don't know that judicial preferences change over time. We know that judicial behavior changes over time. So revealed preferences change over time. That doesn't mean that actual preferences change over time. So there are two views in this literature that's just developed. One is a freshman effect, that judges when they first get to the court, their preferences are one way, and then the process of being on the court, there's no real theory about what that is, changes their preferences. And the other is a more general, just judicial drift. Judicial preferences change over time. We don't know when or how or in what direction. So there's lots of reasons, I think, to criticize these literatures. The complete lack of theory is one. But what we're trying to say is even the evidence that they point to of changing judicial behavior, changing judicial votes, doesn't show what they claim to show. Instead, judicial behavior might change given static preferences, and we'll show why. Even more stark, we have some justices who seem to change in more than one direction. So the change is not monotonic. Justice Rehnquist, for example, everybody seems to think that he was sort of becoming more conservative, if anything, but then when he became Chief Justice, he moderated his behavior. So this curvature that we see here. Justice Black is another example where we've got sort of a wavering of his preferences. And it's even more stark. This is actually taken from, this is not my graph, this is a graph taken from the Judicial Drift paper by Epstein et al. And they say if we don't even look at Justice Black in all of his cases, if we just look at civil rights, we've got this arc of change in preferences. Now, to me, that's not very well theorized. Why would Justice Black, a textualist of all people, like have such a radical change in his preferences? We might think there are other explanations, such as the court changing around Justice Black at this time. We know that the issues that were being addressed in 1940 are different to the issues that were being addressed in 1970. So there's lots of reasons to think that this is actually not showing actual judicial preference change. And so I'm just addressing one of those reasons. I'm not taking on all of the possibilities about, you know, changes in the overall court, for example. That's another reason. Okay, so that's our first motivation, this kind of actual judicial preferences change. And the other is, as I said, this idea that maybe justices have an incentive when they get on the court to still not reveal their true ideology. Now, why would that be? So President Obama just won re-election, and there's an expectation that he's going to be able to appoint a couple of justices because we've got 4 justices well into their 70s. Now, we might expect a pretty different reaction from the Republicans in the Senate if Justice Scalia or Justice Thomas, 2 of the 70-odd-year-olds, 2 of the septuagenarians retire or die, compared to, if Justice Ginsburg, who's liberal, retires or dies, right? We might expect a much stronger level of recalcitrance because replacing Justice Scalia or Thomas will change the median of the court, right? So we might expect a different reaction. And so that's the general idea. We're going to be much more precise in defining why that is. But when you're on the court, how you vote shapes, sorry, one step back. The median of the court is so important that if that's going to change, then that's going to affect the nomination game that's being played between the Senate and the President. But also what we perceive as the median is itself able to be manipulated by the justices. Okay, so how does that occur? So Chief Justice Roberts gets appointed to the court after doing his little dance in the Senate, but then immediately another vacancy arises. All right, and so Justice Roberts, we sort of have an idea of him being, somewhat conservative, but we don't know how conservative. There's this ambiguity. There's this range around of unknown area around his ideal point, and so we might think that when he gets on the court, how he behaves will affect people's expectations of what will happen with a future nominee, but also people's expectations of where the median is. If Justice Roberts came onto the court and voted quite moderately, then he would look like the median. Whereas if he voted very conservatively at that time, he would look like a conservative justice, and Justice Kennedy would look like the median. So where Chief Justice Roberts positioned himself in terms of his expression of preferences actually changes the perception of what the median of the court is. And what the median of the court is, as I'm going to show in a moment, is going to determine what the President and the Senate can agree upon. All right, so what we show overall is that ideologies are going to be revealed over time. We will get to figure out where justices' true ideologies are, but we can't necessarily take their first expressions, their first votes, and think that that's necessarily an accurate representation of their true ideal points. All right, so we consider, I'm just going to put this up, but I'm going to actually put this more simply. So we're working off this classic game by Muraski and Shippen. And so I'm just going to go through that so that you can see what we're adding. All right, so Muraski and Shippen, let's put my notes, consider that they look at what's called the nomination games that the President and the Senate play and try and figure out where the equilibrium nominee is going to be, what they can agree upon. All right. Okay, so they consider three situations. They've got the unconstrained game, and this is from the point of view of the President. Right? So if the President has agenda-setting power, he has the power to nominate, and the Senate can only confirm. In this situation, the Senate doesn't like where the median is, so the President can appoint someone at his ideal point, get exactly what he wants. The Senate's not going to constrain him. Right? Then there's the fully constrained game, is where we've got the Senate, the median, and the President. And here the Senate and the President can't agree upon anything, and so where the median of the court is all that they can agree on. So already you're going to see how our model comes into this, in that if you can change the perception of the median, then what the equilibrium outcome in the fully constrained game is going to be, it's going to depend on, it's going to affect the future nominee. And then finally we've got what they call the semi-constrained game, where it goes, let me get this right, median, Senate, and the President here. And here, the President is somewhat constrained. He gets to pull he gets to change the court in that he can get the Senate to agree on a movement to the right, but not all the way to his preferences. So how far right can he pull the median of the court? Not just to the position of the Senate. He can actually pull it to the position, this, M brackets S. And that's the position that's equidistant for the Senate between the median of the court as it is now on the left, Senate's left, and the court and the new outcome on the right. So as long as you make the Senate indifferent, you don't go any further than that. So we're going to assume that this point is to the left of this, just to left of the President, just for simplicity's sake. Okay, so here we've got a 9-person court instead of the simple 3-person. Here we're actually considering multiple justices. So what the median is going to be on a 9-person court is going to be the midpoint between A4 and A5, right? on the court, right? So when a justice retires, right? So what the median is going to be perceived to be is going to be a product of these alphas, which are the ideal points of the different justices, right? So what the median is here, in terms of Moraski and Shippen's outcomes, is going to be a product of how the different justices are arrayed, right? So if you can see now that if you have a new justice come on, they're on the court and they expect someone else to retire, how they position themselves, if they are A4, for example, they might move to the left or right, and that can actually change what the perception of the median is, and the perception in this case, if this is in a semi-constrained case, what the perception of the inverse of the median is as well from the Senate's perspective. All right, so, and this term here is going to be this. So here we've got, what is the median in this case? It's going to be, when we look at a simple 3-person court, one person retires, so you've got 2 justices remaining. Then you've got alpha 1 plus alpha 2 all over 2, right? So that's what the median is going to be. So if you're alpha 1 on a 3-person court, you can affect where the median is going to be perceived to be, right, based on your behavior. And here it's going to be this term, it's going to be this term, sorry, 2 alpha minus, and it's just basic, adding them together, right, to figure out what the inverse point of the, so it's going to be this thing. It's going to be this 2 minus alpha 1 plus alpha 2 all over 2. Okay, just to 2 alpha s, sorry. Okay, all right, so the first thing that we've done in terms of changing this model, is this the next slide? Oh, actually, I'm going to come back to that. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in, we're separating out the median into these points, into the 2 different justices, and trying to figure out what the incentive of each of these justices are. Their ideal points represented here as the alphas. The other thing that we're going to do is we introduce an ambiguity term. So so instead of just having, his alpha 1, we are going to introduce this term delta, which this is going to be plus delta or minus delta on either side. So we don't think that Justice Roberts could be all the way over here as a really liberal justice. We know he's in this range, but we don't know where in this range, right? So that's what we're going to introduce. And so we can think about whether cases are going to give us additional information or not based on whether it lies in this delta term or not. Okay, so first of all, we have to think about how a justice is generally going to vote. So we've got the scale here between level of conservatism of a judge. Here we've got a judge who's reasonably conservative, 2/3 of the way, roughly, towards being conservative. And so that means when we get cases, we can figure out, if we knew what alpha G generic is, then we could know exactly which way they're going to vote. When cases are more conservative than Justice G, then they're going to be the outcome's going to be liberal. But when they're more liberal than alpha G, which is going to be more of the time because he has a general tendency to vote conservative, then all of these cases are going to go conservative. So it's kind of a switch. So we've got here probability of conservative on the right, but it means that the more conservative you are, the fewer and fewer cases are to your right, such that you want to switch them back to being liberal, right? Okay, so what we're introducing is ambiguity around alpha G, and I actually don't have a picture of this, but we have to think about cases that are actually going to tell us more information, narrow down what alpha G is. So if we've got a case that's over here, a gamma case, we call this gamma, it's not actually going to tell us anything because it's already outside the range. Whereas within this range of delta, if you get a gamma here, then the justice is going to decide it, and it's going to shift what this delta range is, right? So it's going to shift, instead of being from here to here, the ambiguous range, when we have a case within this range, it's going to shift from here to here. And that's going to change what our expectation of alpha is, because our expectation, the best we've got, is that it's in the middle of the ambiguous range. So this is the new alpha, right? So these cases are informative, and cases outside of this delta range are uninformative. Now, one thing we don't do in the model is is play around with, how big delta is. Like future models, I think, this could be interesting as to how precise we get. But what we do show is that over time, it's going to, because if we get any informative cases, that's going to get narrower and narrower. And so therefore, we're going to learn more. We're going to get closer and closer to the justice's real ideology. The model is actually about, like, when are we going to think that the justice is going to vote truthfully? Why would they vote untruthfully? Because, if we come back to here, if you can misrepresent your own position, then you're going to shape what the perception of the median is, and that's going to shape whether a new nominee is going to be confirmed or not. According to whether they're, to the left or the right of the perceived median, but it's not going to be the real median of the court. So they're going to, a justice is going to, the whole sort of model here is when is a justice going to vote untruthfully, but it's still going to depend on, if they vote untruthfully outside this delta range, then it's not going to make sense. People aren't going to believe it. So they should only vote, and being within the informative range is a first requirement as to whether they're going to be an incentive to vote truthfully or not. Untruthfully, sorry. Okay, so what we're going to find, oh, yes.
Now, the dimension you talked about is liberal versus conservative. Is that a stable measurement over time? And if so, how do you go about adjusting it for the differences in issues that come up?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and Tony and I just spent the morning talking about this, about whether we've just got one dimension of judicial voting at all, which I think is a really good question. And I think the Justice Black figure is, you could say that what this is a product of is not whether the court changed or whether the justice changed, but actually what issue came to define the court such that we changed from our economic cases to our social cases, such the actual sort of the scale upon which we're deciding cases changed as well. Now, I think that's a really important question. At the moment, we're kind of working within the paradigm that there is just sort of this liberal conservative one-dimensionality, but I actually think you're right to question that. This model doesn't really go outside of that. And I don't know, I'd have to think about whether we could change I have some testable hypotheses later on about whether you could change that based on there being a second dimension. But yeah, we are working within that paradigm. But I think you're right to question the paradigm, I guess is my answer. Yeah.
So what is the time dimension? So it all depends on whether Obama is elected, Mitt Romney is elected, because whether you have a conservative or liberal president is determine the strategic game, right?
Yes.
So your model, does it capture that aspect? I'm not sure.
As to whether the president and Senate preferences change?
No, since you have to think about, say, you act strategically, then it depends on whether you have a conservative or you have a liberal president, but you're not so sure, right? So how can you...
Yeah, so we are assuming that you know that the president and Senate's preferences are known to the justices. So we don't have the same ambiguity about their preferences. I think that there's reason to say why that would be the case. I mean, there's obviously incentives for the president to, look at Mitt Romney, right? He argued lots of different positions, in order to be elected. Like once you get elected, you have the same kind of incentives. So there is ambiguity around, where the true preferences of the president and Senate are. We're looking at it from the point of view of, what do the president and Senate do about ambiguity of judicial preferences? And we assume that there's knowledge the other way. And I think that's not an unusual approach.
But I'm not talking about whether a sitting president is ambiguous. How could you predict for sure whether Obama is going to win or Romney is going to win? So
we're not looking at that. We're looking at a given nomination game, like a president and Senate, and then what do they want to do? So what does the current president and the current Senate want to do? Now it is an important question, because if we're talking about a justice voting untruthfully so as to shape future nominations, that depends on whether there's going to be a change. So we talk about this, we have just sort of a footnote on this. What we do is look at how often you expect another nomination to occur within the 2-year period that the president and Senate can't change. And we actually see a lot of that. Like, it's very unusual for there not to be another nomination, like for either the first or second, from the perspective of the first or second justice, there's going to be a second nomination within the 2-year period. Like they do often come in pairs. Yeah, but I mean, if you don't expect a nomination anytime soon, if you're if you're Justice Ginsburg's replacement and you're pretty confident that Scalia and Thomas are going to be on the court until they die, then you don't have the same incentive. It's true. All right. So in terms of our main results, what we do is our first result is that, and this is kind of a little bit by assumption, is that the moderate justice is always going to vote truthfully. Now, that's got an asterisk on it, because when we take away some of our assumptions, that's actually not necessarily true. But the idea is essentially, at least in a 3-person game, if you vote untruthfully, then that means that the case is not going to reflect your preferences. So there's a big cost to that. Whereas the benefit of affecting future nominees is uncertain. And so you have to weigh off against that certain cost as against the uncertain benefit. Whereas for extremist justices, the cost is less so because you're not pivotal, right? Now the asterisk occurs is, what if we change our assumptions and say this delta region is so wide that in fact it can cover another justice. So if the moderate justice and the extremist justice are caught up in each other's ambiguous range, then nobody even knows who the median is before retirement. And so therefore that can actually make there be an incentive for the moderate justice to actually vote untruthfully. But they will always vote untruthfully less often than the extremist justices for that same reason in terms of the cost-benefit function. So so that's why the asterisk is there. But essentially, we expect that there will be, in terms of our first graphs as to whether we'll see a smooth convergence or this arced shape in terms of expression of ideology, the moderate justice is just going to reveal themselves. That delta range is just going to get smaller, and you're going to reveal yourself over the time. Now, the extremist justices, on the other hand, can have an incentive to exaggerate their ideology. So a conservative justice might actually appear more conservative at first and then more liberal, or vice versa, depending on the nomination game. And if I have time, I'll go through that. But the point is that you have an incentive to at times, to actually appear more conservative before you come back to appearing more liberal, or vice versa. So we see that our results show this, explain this non-monotonic movement that the freshman effect literature just can't explain. Why would have this arc that we see in Justice Black, for example. All right, the direction, like whether you're going to understate or overstate your ideology, whether if you're a liberal justice, you're going to appear to be more liberal or less liberal, like whether you want to appear more moderate or even more extreme. Both of those incentives can exist, and it's going to depend on which nomination game you're playing and where the justice is, right? So I'm going to go through that, but that's our result for the meantime. And as well as the relative ideological positions of the president and the Senate and the justice, it's also going to depend on your expectation of retirement probabilities of the other justices. Now, we actually have taken this out of the paper, and we're going to write a separate paper on this, but the intuition is easy. Like, the more likely you think it is that somebody's going to retire in the next round, the more incentive there is for you to misrepresent your position now with all of the costs that are involved in that, because you think there's going to be a nominee, and you want to, the whole idea of this is to shape perceptions of the court so as to shape the equilibrium nominee. So that's the essential idea there. And that's why retirement probabilities are large here as well. And then finally, untruthful voting is also going to depend on the case characteristics of I won't go through that right now, but it's essentially about, for example, whether the case is informative or not, whether it lies in this range is the key to that. All right, so we've seen this. So I'm not going to go through the whole model, but we're looking at a 3-person court. Obviously, that makes it a little easier for us. It also means it's going to be more stark as to who the median is. So we are making it easier for ourselves. And other than that, we've sort of seen these, sort of gone through these terms. We're looking at a 2-period game, so you vote in the first game, and then you're going to have a second. Someone's going to retire or not retire, and then with certain probability, and then you vote in the second round. Here's the essential model in pictures. So the new justice, we're going to look at it from the point of view of the new justice. They join the court. They can vote. They get to vote in this case. And then the President and the Senate update their expectations about what alpha is in this way that I've described. This delta range gets decreased. It can get decreased in this direction if gamma is over here as well. Now, one thing we assume at first is that the President and Senate are just kind of short-sighted. They only care about who they nominate, and they don't consider the possibility of untruthful voting by the justice. We actually relax that assumption, and so make the President and Senate look at how that changes things to make them like the justice, to be strategic or to anticipate strategic behavior by the justice. And then there's this possibility that the justice retires. It's not certain, it's only probabilistic. And then we play the same game again. Okay, but in the second case, there's no third period. So you're not going to lie. At some stage, you've got to expect that your tenure is going to end. And so you're not going to keep voting untruthfully in the hope of being on a court with justices who are like you. Eventually, you're going to want to vote truthfully. Right? So we simplify that by having 2 periods. But the result is that eventually, you're going to reveal, over time, you're going to reveal your true preferences. There's going to be less and less incentive to lie. Now, in this case, there's just 2 periods. Actually, if we think about the number of terms, justice served, it might be 20. But it explains why, in our initial graphs, we see this gradual movement. There's less and less incentive to obfuscate over your true ideology. All right, so this is as I talked about, here you've got this cost to an untruthful vote. You've got just a probability that your vote will actually determine the outcome of the case, and you have to weigh that against this benefit that you receive. Yes.
From what distribution are the cases drawn?
So we are not really doing that. We're just saying we're just looking at in terms of the probability of a given gamma. Like we're not, so it's all done in terms of like whatever the probability is. Yeah. All right, we've gone through this. Oh yes.
Now, unless I've got this all wrong, it seems that there are 2 assumptions that are being made to build the model on. One is that there is a truth, a realized conscious truth on the part of any justices dealing with whatever specific legal issues involved. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether, in fact, there is that level of a consistent level of consciousness around a specific ideology. Right. That drives an individual justice. Is there external evidence that this is the case?
So you mean when you talk about in truth, in terms of there is a true ideology that the person
yes,
has?
And that they're aware of. I mean, to lie consciously, you have to have a conception of what the truth is. Yeah, and is there such a conception in the minds of the individuals involved?
Yeah. Well, we can think of an ideal point. It doesn't have to be like you can think of that as an aggregation of your preferences across a number of different issues. So everybody has what they would actually prefer an outcome of the case to be, right? I actually have a different paper on the notion of judicial abstention and why we don't see judges just abstaining. It's generally accepted that judges have opinions. Now, your first question was, can we aggregate those opinions on one dimension, right? But now the question is, are there really true preferences there that we can aggregate?
Well, what I would have in mind would be that judges write a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, they write autobiographies, they have obiter dicta, all kinds of written evidence that jurists produce. Is there any external evidence that they actually have a concept of what a truth is, and that in fact they deliberately and systematically rule in a manner that's at variance with that realized and expressible truth?
So in terms of the term truth, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but certainly there's a lot of evidence that that judges behavior is highly predictable based on, on standard ideological measures. We can also show that there are other things that affect that. And so we talk about judges as having an ideology, but we're not really talking about what that consists of, like whether that's, that could be doctrinally determined or what have you. But they still have some ideal point, and the further a case is ruled from that ideal point, the less utility they have, the less happy they are about that. So I think, I think it's fair to say, however constituted, everybody has preferences over outcomes. And whatever you want to call that, whatever you think that's driven by, or whether you think that's consistent or not, is going to affect whether the person... so the way I would represent that is thinking about their ideal point, this delta range. There could be, like, so you might have, if this is Justice I, in some cases you're going to vote liberal, in some cases you're going to be more, your preferences, not just your vote, your actual preferences are going to be more liberal. You might have a different view on Sixth Amendment than you have on Fourth Amendment, right? So this ideal point that we talk about here doesn't have to be, we don't have to think about that as a strict rule. It's an aggregation. And so in fact, one of the things we do in our paper is we talk about types, and we talk about, like, here's our alpha. And so this person is mostly conservative, right? Because they're on this continuum, this probability of being conservative continuum. But you're going to vote, for these cases, you're actually going to vote liberal. And these cases, so here you're going to vote against type. So you're not, so this person's, I said this is about 2/3 of the way, and that's because a third of the time, if you had just a uniform distribution of cases, then you would vote liberal in a third of the cases. Right? So all we have to assume is that we can somehow aggregate into, we can aggregate this down to, and if they don't have this kind of, if their preferences don't lie like in this kind of distribution, if you actually have a distribution like this, for example, then we're in tricky territory. And that would have to suggest that there's more than one dimension at play, because otherwise how do you end up with, with this kind of distribution? Does that answer the question? Okay. All right. Okay. So this graph, I think we can do more simply than this. Just want to put this up here. I think this is simpler than this, so easier to understand. All right. So here we've got two different scenarios, remember, from our unconstrained, semi-constrained, and so on. We're putting aside the unconstrained. That's not such an interesting situation. But here we're thinking about the fully constrained situation where the median of the court, which is going to be, the perceived median is going to be the midpoint between these two, right, is between the Senate and the President, and here it's over to the left, and the Senate is in the middle. Okay, so in the first situation, you're going to say this justice, let's look at alpha 1 and the incentives of alpha 1, that the outcome here is going to be at the perceived median of the court, right? And so if this justice, we've got this ambiguity around justice, and the more that this justice actually votes this way, this is their true preferences, but the more that she actually votes here and makes it look like she's over here, the more the median is going to actually move to the left, right? The perceived median is going to move to the left as well. So the more that this person, this liberal justice, votes even more liberally, so votes untruthfully, that's going to move the perceived median of the court to the left, and so that's going to move what nominee could be agreed upon by the Senate and the President on either sides to the left. So here you're going to have an incentive to exaggerate your ideological leaning. So you're liberal, but you actually want to appear to be more liberal than you in fact are. All right, whereas in this case, the outcome is not the median, remember. The outcome is this SM point, right? And so here again, we look at the liberal justice, and we know that the median, whatever the inverse of the median is going to be the equilibrium outcome. So the more that this justice actually goes to the right, looks like, votes as if going to the right, the more the median of the court is going to be perceived to the right, and the less the President can constrain the Senate, and that this equilibrium outcome is actually going to be moved to the left. right? And so there you have an incentive to understate your ideological leanings, right? So this is the heart of the paper, really, in a lot of ways, in that you've got these, depending on the ideological distribution of yourself and the other justice and the Senate and the President, so depending on which nomination game you're playing, you could either want to appear more extreme than you are or less extreme than you are in the first round of voting, so as to influence the nominee. And that's going to depend, so whether this amount that's gained, like in this case, this amount that's, well actually this amount that's gained, technically speaking, and then here, you know, this amount that's gained, whether that's going to be enough to compensate you for potentially having cases go the opposite way than you wanted in the first round because you're voting untruthfully, right? So that's kind of the heart of the matter. And so this is basically showing the same thing, but in slightly more complex terms. Whether you vote truthfully in the first case, and the median's going to be perceived here, and in the second case, you vote here, and this is going to be the range of difference, right? And that's it for the fully constrained. And then the second case, it's the same thing, but instead of just looking at alpha plus alpha, you know, alpha 1 plus alpha 2 on 2, we're looking at 2 alpha s minus that, right? So we want to figure out what the Senate's, we're trying to look at the difference between this, so we take 2 alpha plus that, right, instead to get to this point. Right? And so then you weigh that as against, you know, your expected, your delta for the, because it's going to be in a future round, your probability that it's going to determine the case, and then weigh that as against the certain cost of voting untruthfully. Right?
Can I ask you kind of a
Sure.
little bit sort of broader question? So assuming people, the judges do sometimes or most of the time vote untruthfully, but is it really true that the expectation about the nomination politics is the major driving force? I could think of an alternative explanation. They're doing vote trading. So it's not about the future nominees. They just want to, you know, scratch each other's back. So I support you in this issue, then you support me in another issue. Wouldn't that be a more pertinent driving force?
I actually don't think so. And here's why. We have had justices, lots of studies of justices and voting strategically. There's lots of evidence that they decide which cases to take based on whether they think they can win, that their voting outcomes are strategic, etc. Lots of different levels of strategy. The one thing that we've never shown is vote trading. And if you interview judges, they will agree to all sorts of strategic behavior, such as, you know, manipulation of cert, but they will not, you will never ever have a judge acknowledge that they vote trade. And why is that? Because the very essence of judging is that you're supposed to determine the case before you and not just trade off on policy with, and then you're a legislator.
Then
Right.
do you have direct evidence? Do judges acknowledge that they vote based on their expectation of nomination politics?
No, I don't think that they've been asked that particular question because this is new, but they certainly, they admit to other strategic behavior, quite frankly, usually when they're anonymous. So take H.W. Perry's book, for example, on cert. Judges admit to all sorts of strategic manipulation in that, but they don't admit to vote trading. But, you know, yes, you're right. There could be other, you know, this is a model, it's a simplification, it's already probably complex enough, but, you know, there's other things that are going to give you an incentive to vote truthfully or untruthfully, and you've got to weigh those against each other. So maybe this is just a you know, a partial equilibrium. Maybe this is just a sub-game of a broader game, but we're just looking at the nomination part of that game. But yeah, you're right. You know, sure, there are other incentives, you know, to vote untruthfully potentially as well. You know, legitimacy. You know, the ACA case, for example. You know, lots of theories about why Chief Justice Roberts, you know, upheld Obamacare, right? And a lot of it's to do with, you know, a lot of theories are because, you know, he was worried about the cost to the court. So he's weighing against the you know, the cost of voting against his true preferences here. And he's not just looking at nominees, he's looking at future, you know, and that's kind of a nominee factor as well. Like there's nominees in there. So obviously it's more complicated than this, but yeah. All right, so if there aren't further questions, I'll continue going on. We're actually most of the way through. So in terms of evolution, this sort of just captures the difference in evolution. So sometimes we're going to see because we have this incentive to exaggerate versus understate depending on the setup. So sometimes this is the true ideology, and here we've got, liberal versus conservative. Usually you're going to have this monotonic direction over time. You're going to have, it's going to converge on the true ideology of the justice. But in some cases, you're actually going to want to appear more extreme than you actually are before eventually coming in to express your true preferences because of this situation. Because sometimes you're going to want to exaggerate and sometimes you're going to want to understate. All right, so this, if we think about back to our initial graphs of the different movements in judicial ideology over time, we have a theory as to why you'd see this, and nobody else has a theory of that, right? And we also have, we see a lot of this as well. Most of the time we're going to see this, which is, so this fits the data. Most justices change. Like 25 of the last 26 justices show significant change that who've decided at X number of cases. I can't remember. But basically, all of the justices show change. Now, do you believe that justices who are appointed usually in middle age, mostly after having been judges for a number of years, top of their class, etc., that they don't know their actual preferences until they get to the Supreme Court? That all of them show significant change in their actual ideologies over time? No. Our theories predict most justices are going to have this monotonic movement, and then some of them are going to have this other movement. And that's exactly what the data shows. Now, I talked about strategic. What I want to jump ahead to is these testable hypotheses. So what we want to do is allow our theory to be differentiated from this whole judicial drift theory to the extent that it's a theory. Maybe the freshman effect theory at least says compare to year one. So what we do is we come up with a bunch of hypotheses from our results by which we would be able to differentiate between these two possibilities. And so if it's actually just expressions of preference, then we should see differences between moderate and extreme judges, right? The moderate justices shouldn't show as much change as the extreme justices do. So if we had good measures of, now the problem with, say, Martin Quinn scores is that they actually have different variation around the ideal point for the extremists than they do for the moderates. So it's hard. So another problem with this judicial drift literature is that they're comparing justices with different assumed variants. So we might need a different measure, but certainly these other, the measures that are being used at the moment, we could apply the same hypotheses. So we'll see difference from moderates versus extremes. We'll also see, we can observe this exaggeration under certain conditions when we have, depending on the nomination game that's being played, versus we can see understatement depending on, if you're having a semi-constrained situation. So in the fully constrained versus the semi-constrained, and that's easy to get data on. Like we know we have lots of measures of the position of the president and the Senate. So we can certainly set up what the games are, and so we can differentiate that way. And then we can also look at where you are in your tenure as to whether we're going to see an effect. So I think these are really important because it's we can get up here and attack that other literature, but here's a way of actually saying it's not just that it's observational equivalence, it's that we can actually differentiate as well. We have a bunch of hypotheses stemming from our theory as to what we should see, which they don't have. Okay, here's my final slide. And this is just sort of summarizing the results that we've seen. So what we're doing is basically showing that if judges are rational, if they are strategic, if they care about future cases as well as current cases, even if we discount that with a discount rate, then we should see it makes sense that there's an incentive to vote strategically in early cases so as to shape the court in future cases. That there will be both an incentive to understate or overstate depending on the setup, the ideological setup of the other actors. And this is really important, I think, that the fact that, setting aside the retirement possibility, but the fact that early cases are less trustworthy than later cases has implications for how we should measure judicial ideology as well. It suggests that there's differences in reliability of those scores. So if you have justices who we think of, like say, look at Justice Blackmun, right? At the end of his tenure, he looked a lot more liberal than he did at the beginning of his tenure. but maybe that means he was actually more liberal, and then, you know, he was voting, he was on the court with Chief Justice Berger, he was under his shadow, you know, whatever reasons he had to, you know, to not be as truthful, you know, or whether it's future nominations, whatever, it suggests that later voting is more reliable than earlier voting. So, you know, we should consider that when we're looking at, you know, if we're trying to characterize specific justices, but also think about what weight we should give to different measures of judicial behaviour. And then finally, the strategic retirement question, which was cut out of the paper that you saw. But the central idea is, you know, whether you're going to want to not only, you know, whether your own expectation of other justices' retirement is going to shape how you want to vote, but also you might want to think about when you want to retire on the basis of, you know, what's the best way to ensure that the person who replaces you looks like you and therefore is going to continue sort of the legacy of your view of the law, or whatever it is that you think that justices are doing on the court. But, okay, any other questions? Yeah.
So I had one thought, go back to the hypothesis slide.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a theoretical question, and then I don't know the literature, so I want to say that first.
Okay.
But the freshman effect, I'm not totally convinced is necessarily in your theory, because the freshman effect could just be uncertainty, not purposeful ambiguity. While the H2, H3 I find more persuasive as actual ambiguity, right? Like, because one thing when you presented the theory, I was thinking, why this delta term instead of just uncertainty? And then as you went through it, I think that actually makes sense. But a freshman effect could just be uncertainty of the freshman about others and about the existing justices on the freshman.
So uncertainty how to vote?
No, uncertainty about each other's preferences, right? So you're a new person, you don't know what they're doing, and certainly the old members of the court don't know as much about the new person. And yes, there's information from where they were served previously,
right,
but that could go away, not due to strategic ambiguity, just because they learn.
We get more information over time. Sure. Yeah.
So so there's still strategic behavior, but just a different theory. So I don't know if the I don't know if that's what the literature, the freshman effect literature is arguing, that there's actually uncertainty, not strategic ambiguity.
No, I mean they seem to be arguing that, you know, it's actual change, like there's actual change of preferences. But yeah, you could interpret it different. I mean, there are different interpretations that are available of this.
Okay.
And I mean, I think that most models that you're going to come up with, you know, should show you that later, you know, just because eventually you're going to retire. So if there's any untruthful voting, like forget about the rest of the setup. That's kind of just eventually, you know, you're going to die, right? And so.
Or I guess the other thing is they're like a poker game. Like imagine if people have never played poker together. You actually don't know how good people are, what they do. You play 10 games of poker, you learn about them. But some people will strategically be bad, unpredictable, and other people will be predictable. So ambiguity and uncertainty are actually different, and does that matter for your?
Well, you would think then that we would expect to see less movement at the Supreme Court than on other courts, right? Because the Supreme Court's so publicized that everybody knows, you know, what Scalia stands for.
And I mean publicized just within the 9. Right?
Yeah.
Like you're gathering.
But you're the new justice. You should have a pretty good idea of what the preference of the other justices are when you enter the Supreme Court, whereas when you enter, you know, the whatever district court or whatever federal court, you would have less certainty, that uncertainty. So maybe we could think of a difference, the testable hypothesis there that says, you know, we should expect to see more movement on lower courts than the Supreme Court.
But in your model, you assume that they're certain of each other's preferences.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
well, no, the other justices don't know. The Delta region applies to the other justices as well.
Okay. But it's not uncertainty about preferences. That's strategic ambiguity.
Well, you don't know. No, when the justice enters the court, they've got this range, you know, in which we know that their ideal point is somewhere in that range. Now, you might have a strategic interest. We're actually doing a paper on, a sort of follow-up paper on, you know, where you're going to want to take cases as well. So getting to Tony's question is, you know, and you might actually want to, whether you want to, you know, minimize that is not actually clear. Like people would assume, oh, you want to take the case closest to your own preference, and then bang, you know, that gets rid of the most ambiguity. But we actually show that's not necessarily true. It's a slightly different question. But sorry, I got a little sidetracked by that.
I guess, I mean, just theoretically, I don't know, it's not totally clear why you use delta instead of just assume uncertain preferences, especially on the freshman and time delay.
Well, delta is the range of the
Yeah, I mean,
uncertain
how
preferences.
would you assume
It's
uncertain
measuring-
preferences?
Well, you're assuming they're certain about preferences, but then you add a delta term, right?
Well, the only person who's certain about it is alpha 1 knows alpha 1's true preferences, but everybody else sees this delta range.
Okay,
Yeah.
So then that will go down
Yeah.
okay.
as they face cases.
But you also said it might go up. That's where, if it's uncertainty, it will go down over time if there's being strategic.
No,
negative
the uncertainty will never increase. Because if it's outside the range, then it's just it's an uninformative case because we already know which way you're going to decide. We already know which way you're going to decide these cases and these cases. So the only uncertainty, this is the uncertainty range. So cases are only informative within this range. And then that can only decrease. It can stay the same. So if you get a gamma out here, if you get a case out here, then it stays the same. But any case that you get in here, you're going to decide one way or the other, and it's going to. Yeah.
And I'll preface by saying that even though I was an Andrew Martin student, I know very little about courts, shockingly little, for being somebody that worked at Russia. But I had a question about the observable implications of the freshman effect.
Yeah.
So based on your theory, we would expect Sotomayor and Kagan to perform differently, right, at the beginning of their terms?
Well, they were appointed. They were each appointed under the same setup, right? The same nomination game. So.
But Sotomayor can predict that soon enough there will be
I see
another
what you mean.
appointment.
Oh yeah.
And Kagan can assume
Yes.
that actually there won't be soon.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so given that you said that justices often come in pairs, it seems that then the test of this is to see if over time, the behavior of that second justice who's
Yeah.
appointed and who sees that actually the horizon for the next appointment is further away, and so their behavior is less likely to be able to strategically influence future appointments. The behavior over time should differ, even though they're appointed under the same president and Senate, and therefore we should expect them to be ideologically similar.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I want to be careful about the specific way you suggest to test the hypothesis, but in general, where is it? So when members are closer to retirement, like we can look at their age, we can look at the length of time on the court and so on, and so look at people's expectations about the chances of a retirement. Now, the problem is with the way you suggested the hypothesis is, well, we've seen this pattern of pairs, therefore we expect pairs going forward. I wouldn't necessarily say that's true. And so we don't necessarily want to say, okay, so when Kagan was appointed, we know that nobody came after Kagan within the next couple of terms. But it was quite possible, that Ginsburg could have retired. She was pretty elderly and so on. So we want to be careful not to, apply our ex post knowledge to our ex ante expectation. But yes, in terms of other, more empirically testable things, such because we can't really know their expectation, but we can look at things like how old they are. We could look at illness, for example. One of my colleagues actually has a paper, what he calls strategic death, which sounds crazy, right? But it's basically, well, if you don't die on the court, then you've sort of made a decision to retire. And so if you die on the court, it might be because you're holding out, and death came along unexpectedly. But if you die off the court, then that's kind of the strategic death. Not that you shoot it, but yeah. So we can, people have looked at things like this in terms of, and from that they infer your preferences about who replaces you based on, whether you do retire and whether you stay on the court and die is that you choose not to retire. So we can, there have been studies like that haven't applied this particular theory, but yes, I think that's definitely possible to do, yeah. And we do talk about it. Yeah.
I'm thinking that this kind of theory might apply, and realize boards of directors of most corporations are not very contentious and don't have this kind of problem, but it could apply to any such organization, right?
Yes,
It's
I guess.
The Supreme Court is particularly salient, but it's a more general theory, right? About how a collection of people individuals make decisions based on who will replace them, who their colleagues are, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, so I think the Supreme Court is different though, and it's different relevantly. One is that judges can't come out and say, these are my preferences, this is what I want. Like they're supposed to reveal their preferences get revealed through case votes.
Yeah.
And it's also, you know, the Senate sort of has to say when the Supreme Court justice nominee comes before the Senate, say, I don't really want to answer this question because I can decide those cases. If you're interviewing someone to be on a board, they can't say, oh, I'm not going to tell you what I believe. You're just going to have to wait to see, give me life tenure and then you'll see. So it is different. I think this model is particularly pertinent to justices because of the restrictions on what they can say. And so for boards, I mean, I'm no expert in corporate law, but it seems to me that there's more.
I'm thinking of the HP board, Hewlett Packard board, in its crazy days. Where?
Yeah, I don't know. Can
Oh.
you explain a little bit more?
Was Hewlett Packard, maybe I have the wrong company, it was the son, I'm sorry, I don't remember. I'm sure I have it wrong now, but there was a period of time when they were all going crazy.
Right.
The woman was head of it, and she was head of the corp. Anyone know?
Oh, Hewlett Packard, you're thinking of Carly.
No.
Carly
Anyway,
Fiorina.
no, it wasn't for me. It was, doesn't matter.
Okay.
The point is that I think you might talk to your business school colleagues at Kellogg, because they might find this very interesting, even though I understand distinctive features, but I believe board members often don't reveal what's going on.
Okay.
And more importantly, they don't know where they stand when things get icky.
Right. Well, if you don't know your own preferences, then we're in a whole new ball game of complexity.
No. Let us say,
Yeah.
all right.
You don't know how you're going to react to a certain situation.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is say that this is a much more general theory, even though
I
the
appreciate
specifics of that,
Yeah.
and I understand how specific it is, but I think you have a better story to tell that's more generally interesting to a very rich audience.
Okay, thank you.
If the preferences are real over time of these justices, and we don't know until the second period or farther on if justices are extreme or moderate, we only know in hindsight. How does that help us, like, sort of estimate or predict if the freshman effect will take place, or if taking into account, I mean, how are you able to predict
Yeah,
how
so
extreme it will be?
so if you make so our general statement is that you should take more from later cases, take more information, put more reliability on it. Now your question is, okay, but we don't know what's the end game, right? We might be here in time and thinking, oh look, Justice Rehnquist is more, actually let's go to the next one. Okay, we might be here in time and thinking, oh wow, we should really pay attention to these votes rather than these. And you're right, in that sometimes we're going to be wrong. There's going to be noise in the data because, but overall, if you look in aggregate, that all these justices, we look at the end of their tenures, we're going to get more information. But sometimes we're going to be wrong, and we're going to, if preferences are like this, if they're that extreme, then we're going to get it completely wrong for Justice Black because true preferences are down here. So you're right, but overall, we should have more accurate information by taking the later scores, even if occasionally we might be looking at it not knowing we're at the end.
After the fact, but before the fact, before you have this huge trend over the career of a justice, beforehand, how are you supposed to know how much they're diverging from their,
Sorry, I misunderstood. You're saying, okay, sorry, I misunderstood. You're saying
how untruthful they're being in the beginning.
Yeah.
No way
We can know we can know what their incentives are given the nomination game that they're in, right? So we can look at the position of the president and we can look at the position of the Senate and what we know of the justice and say, okay, they have an incentive to actually appear more liberal than they would be in this situation, or more conservative than they would be. And so it does actually help us in that situation because we've got information about the president and the Senate. So we do know what game. And we don't know their exact position. And the bigger the delta is, if we have the situation where the delta is so big we don't know where they are relative to, say, the Senate, then we've got problems. But, I don't think that that's generally the case. Most people we do have some information about our nominees. And so as long as we know which game we're in, we should know where their incentive lies. We don't know how much they follow that incentive, but we do know. We might think, okay, we see Justice Rehnquist becoming more conservative, but he's got an incentive to become more conservative because of, where Nixon is and, where the Senate is. Yeah.
One other thing, I think pre-Bork, there was much less pressure on them to reveal much about their voting things.
Oh, yeah.
So, maybe you said this, and so one of your interesting issues is that the, say, pre-Bork appointees may well show different phenomena than ones which then decided they better,
Yeah.
play games,
Yeah.
and they were trained to play games. I mean, that's what they do, that's what the training does.
That's a good
And
point.
the senators are co-conspirators because they, So-
Yeah, no, that's true. This is kind of a more pertinent question in the post-Bork era because we can't narrow that delta range through questioning as much as we used to be able to.
No,
But-
because what people didn't try to that narrow it. Someone got appointed to the Supreme Court and went to senatorial, process. They weren't asked, what would you vote on abortion or what would you do on X? Were
Oh,
they?
no, there used to be, before Bork, there was actually more questioning. And since Bork, people have said, oh, I can't possibly comment because I'm going to get myself in trouble. I mean, because I might decide cases, right?
But no,
and
but
so,
the point is,
you're right, is it like
There was-
FDR, in FDR's time, they just pointed things.
1950s and 60s and early 70s,
Then I think you saw more questioning,
when did it begin? When did they start, anyone know when did they start serious asking these very specific kinds of questions? Anyone know?
I think it was in the post-war, like sort of 50s, 60s era when it began, and I think that's, I don't know if it's about,
And it would be useful for you to get a feel for what this then hearings
Yeah.
were like, because I recall, I'm old enough so I recall,
Yeah.
post-World War II, and my suspicion is that game
Mm.
could not have begun before the late 60s.
Yeah.
And I may be really wrong, but that's my intuition. In other words,
Yeah.
the kind of game where they're trying to find out what they believe, I think before that it was much more respectful and much less, out to kill them.
Yeah. Well, earlier than that, then we had, a whole lot of patronage issues sort of coming into play. We even had seats on the Supreme Court that were supposed to go to particular areas. So, historically, the institutional context has changed for the court in other ways as well. And so maybe it was more backroom deals. So, so-and-so vouched for, Senator X vouched for so-and-so from their home
That's
state
what
because
David
they knew the information. Yeah, exactly.
David Souter's the perfect example.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and so the whole institutional arrangement by which information was gained has changed, and then it became, it might have as much to do with changes in Congress as it does in the court that happen,
Of course it
such
does.
that there's less kind of old boy, this is my man from,
It would be very useful when you do the research to have a historical, sort of have a timeline
Mhm.
where you could characterize the flavor of the appointment process in that way.
Yeah.
It
I
would-
mean, quite frankly, we're cutting out a third of our results from this paper, so we're not going to have room for that. But I think it's an interesting
It would
perspective.
make me start thinking about it, that you might be interested.
Yeah,
I don't mean to insult you, but until I know that,
yeah,
I don't know what to do with all this stuff. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm trying to make you better, stronger.
uh-huh.
And I think you'd be stronger if you took on that issue at some point.
Yeah. I mean, but we literally don't
I don't
have
care
room
about
in
your
this,
paper.
but
You do it whatever you want.
Mhm.
I'm just telling you, you should do it. So at least in your back pocket, you know the answers to my question.
well, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, okay, all right.
Maybe I'm crazy, I don't know.
So I have, I don't know how helpful this is, but I keep thinking about these cases, right, and where they're coming from.
Yeah.
So I look at this shift of the justices moving around, and I wonder what and I just don't know this from the Martin and Quinn stuff, but what is a distribution of the cut points in these cases, would you think, right? So are they drawing, at particular points in time, are they drawing cases that are splitting liberals and conservatives, or are they drawing cases that are biased in one direction or the other? That's obviously something that, endogenously is the kind of thing that cert could affect.
Yeah.
But it could be that what you're looking at in terms of the estimates, and also what you would test using these estimates or if you're going to use this kind of data to test the theory,
Yeah.
you might actually be seeing some just those things could be too liberal or conservative
Yeah.
on the basis of where those cut points are.
Yeah. You know, I think that the Martin Quinn scores are really great for a lot of things. I use them, you know, to look at, you know, ideological alignment and blah, blah, blah. But what I think, and the thing we say in our conclusion is you have to be really careful using them for this kind of analysis. And partly, you know, one of the reasons we don't test our hypothesis is I think that there's a problem with the scores to do this. So the Martin Quinn, and this is the danger, this is why I'm surprised that Martin and Quinn themselves are involved in the whole judicial drift analysis, because they're putting it in, it's basically, it's their dependent variable, it's their independent variable, and you know, they don't have theories over time, you know, as to, you know, where we should expect the movement. They don't have formal theory or even, you know, an intuitive theory as to, you know, when should we expect, you know, this movement versus this movement. And so I am very reluctant to do the testing with these scores, because the way that the scores are developed is they're not a good vehicle for this. And that's why, like, partly what I want to do is just sort of say, and I'm sort of working on another paper on challenging the judicial drift work generally for this reason, and for a bunch of other reasons as well. I mean, so
Maybe at least you should put all the justices to grab together and see if there's a general change in the national mood that everyone is drifting.
well,
And
so
then
here's the
add-
problem. You can't really do that with these scores, because the scores assume that the fewest number of people are changing at any time. So they can't measure changes in the court. They always say, so this is the thing with Justice Black, right? We know what was happening during this period, like 1954 Brown, right? I mean, we know that the court was changing and that society was changing. And I think Justice Black probably was staying pretty still. Like, there's a minor variation, like eventually he came to accept, you know, Griswold, for example, right? You know, but that was sort of a very sort of small, you know, a recognition of stare decisis as much as anything else, right? Justice Black did not move like this. Justice Black was the most stable guy on the court. I just don't believe this. And so what I think is happening is the court is changing. What?
If he didn't move, where are the data coming from?
I think the court is changing around Justice Black. So the Martin Quinn scores assume that the smallest movement that can explain the data is possible. If there are 4 people moving or 5 people moving on the court, they're always going to assume it's the minority moving and the court staying the same. And so I think this is driven, like, as Tony said, the choice of cases could be shaping it. So here we're taking you know, we're still looking at economic cases. Here we're looking purely at social cases. You know, I mean, so that the cases that we're looking at changed. The court is changing. Like, we know that the court is becoming extremely liberal at this point. And look, the court's becoming liberal, or Justice Black's becoming more conservative, or maybe Justice Black's the same and the court became more liberal, right? That's the alternative. And these scores have no way of measuring that. And that's not a criticism of the scores. I think the scores are great. It's a criticism of the use of these scores in this whole, this drift and freshman effect literature. It's not safe to use these scores for this analysis, even if you ignore our theory as to, you know, why you would have this, just in terms of, you know.
Well, I mean, I would say...
I'm no
it's
methodologist, but...
I would just say it sounds a little strong, to be honest. I buy what you're saying about the use of the measures, but I wouldn't say they don't have a theory. They have a very simple theory of sincere voting in the special model, right? That's
Okay, but they have
probably
no,
the wrong theory.
They have no theory as to when, so they have no theory as to
No, but
say,
they have a theory
when do
that
we see
doesn't-
change?
But that's not the point of their paper. They have a very simple theory that the measures are based on. So just, you know, the measures have these problems.
Yeah,
So the people who've used the measures in the past, that part I believe, but I would be careful saying there's no theory underlying their model.
Underlying the drift model.
No, underlying the Martin Quinn.
No, but I'm trying to be careful to say that. I think the scores are really great. It's the application here that has no theory. They have no theory as to say, 20 years in, we should see significant change. They just say, at some point we should see change, and it's going to be significant, and that's going to satisfy us. Now, one thing I think they should do, as I was saying to Tony this morning, like, if you're looking at a 30-year period, you shouldn't be applying 0.05. You should be applying, you know, 1/30th of 0.05, because you don't say which year you should see the change happen, right? So, you know, there's lots of reasons to criticize the drift analysis, and there's no theory there. I think there's a great theory behind the scores. I use the scores all the time. I think they're really good. I just
do they
think...
argue that there's judicial thrift? Or not thrift?
Yes. Yeah, they do.
Drift.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But do people believe that that justices have true beliefs or don't have true beliefs? Am I making?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
these are revealed, though. This is based on revealed behavior
All right,
in
fine. So you-
cases, yeah.
So you never want to talk about true beliefs, you
Well,
never
I
want to talk
mean-
about what they do.
That picture is not, yeah, that picture is what they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. But does anyone talk about?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that's what we're responding to.
Right.
Like this picture is from an article. This is completely cut and pasted from an article where they say, oh, look how much judicial preferences change over time.
Someone wrote a biography of Black, right? There must be several Black
Sure,
Black
yeah.
bios. What do they say?
I don't think they say this.
They don't.
There's no, they say the opposite. They say the court did this.
That's based on anecdotes instead of all of the cases, right?
Yeah.
And then
No,
the same-
it's anecdotes, interviews, whatnot, all right?
Right.
And you could dismiss it, but it would be very interesting in, I understand all this revealed stuff, I have nothing against it, but if I read a bio, which tells me a very different story, and they all agree more or less, then I'm wondering what's going on.
Right, that's-
And that's what I don't see here. In other words, it's not, they're not rat. Justice Black is not a rat. All right?
He's not a-
rat.
Uh-huh.
You can actually talk to the rat.
Uh-huh.
All right?
Oh, he's dead, but yeah. He's a dead rat.
Well, yeah, no, you can talk to the dead rats. But the point is, there's documents and everything.
Yeah,
right?
no, I agree. No, I think that's right. And I think that those biographies would not say this.
And
They
so-
would not agree with this. They would say the opposite.
Or they would say.
They would
and so-
say that this represents the court changing around Justice Black.
And like, for example, your discussion of Rehnquist. Where was I reading about Rehnquist saying he was about to retire and then he didn't and he just died in office? Was it Rehnquist? Who just, did he die?
I don't think Rehnquist was ever going to retire, but maybe
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
no, I
He,
think
he died on the court. But.
Right, because he said he was gonna die and then didn't. Not retire and then didn't. Excuse me, he said he was gonna
Yeah,
retire
a lot of people do that, Martin.
on the court. I mean, he made a very explicit statement, all right?
Right.
Standard statement. So, I mean, I think you need another side story, which is informed by this historical, if you want to call it anecdotal, I'll take anecdotal, but I think it's more than that, documentary and so forth evidence, to play against it, because the rats talk.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. So that's what I've tried to do here is to fill in some of the detail as to why I think Justice Black, this is not an accurate representation of
But
Justice Black.
all those charts, all right? What does the historians who study these guys, who have no great interest in...
Well, the problem with that is that it's very easy to draw on salient cases.
Oh, yeah.
And on salient cases. So, what we're trying to do here is say, look, let's look in aggregate and let the data speak for itself such that we don't have to interpret. We don't have to add our interpretation. We don't have to add our biases as to what we think is important.
This data speaks what it speaks. But until I know a lot more biographical material, I don't know what to do with this. And so, from my point of view, I'd like to know...
But you won't take yes for an answer.
Yeah.
What?
Right? You won't take yes for an answer. I'm telling you what people said about Justice Black, and
Good,
and
fine.
Yeah.
they don't say that, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I can't put that in my paper because I don't have room, but I'm telling you that's, I'm giving you my interpretation based on my reading of the cases, etc., as well as,
Right.
even if it's not, there's mostly math in the paper, but, it's based on intuition as
All
well.
right, never mind, I'm sorry.
Cool. Any last question? Okay.
Well, thank you very
Well,
much.
thanks.